Alrighty, well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be looking at this. This is Chapter 20, talking government, politics, populist, progressives, from 1880 to 1917. Alrighty, so this image depicts an 1894 political march. Coxey's army, they marched on Washington, D.C. during the Depression in 1894. Sorry, my cats are having a fight. Maybe they'll stop in a minute. Anyway, unemployed men were asking for relief from the government. Presence of the United States flag indicates that they see themselves as asking for rights as citizens. They're dressed respectfully. They appear to want the support and respect of those who witnessed their march. They're not trying to be violent or anything like that. They're trying to be respectful, but ask for what they feel they are owed. Alrighty. So, 1880, 1892, start with the electoral politics after Reconstruction. So elections were very close. There was high voter turnout, and partisan conflicts characterized elections. Northerners were disillusioned by the failures of Reconstruction. Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, and Harrison presidencies were limited by the intense competitions for votes. Both parties accused of stuffing ballot boxes and buying votes. So on July 2nd, 1881, President Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau. Some blamed Guiteau's actions on his frustration with the patronage system, granting government jobs to supporters. So 1883, you get the Pendleton Act, which is going to establish the Civil Service Commission. So this means exams. So you couldn't just get a job you weren't qualified for. This is still in place today. You want to work someplace like the post office or the county office or something like that, you have to take an exam to kind of qualify you for the position. This reduced political parties' opportunities to pass out jobs. Liberals' terms use has changed, so that's different than what we call it today. In the 19th century, met Americans who advocated limited and professional government. Mugwumps are liberal Republicans. Liberals wanted smaller government and less regulation. So by 1887, Massachusetts was leading the charge for free, compulsory education and public regulatory commissions. So Mugwumps, they are liberal Republicans, and when we say liberal, we mean they wanted smaller government and less regulation. It's not necessarily what we would coin a liberal today. All right, so if you look right here at these maps, so this is the election of 1880. This is James Garfield going against Winfield Hancock and James B. Weaver. And you can see how super close the election is. 48.5 to 48.1% of the popular vote. This actually encourages voter turnout because people really felt like they had a say. Over here, 1884. You've got Cleveland against James Blaine at 48.5 to 48.2, so an even closer race in 1884. And we are talking, what is that, 29,000 votes right here? Almost 30,000, 29,000. And this one is, I don't know, 40,000 votes? I mean, that is not many. Oh, sorry, skipped. Alrighty, so this is President William Henry Harrison on the left and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge on the right. In 1888, the Republican Party gained control of Congress and the White House. They gave pensions to all Union veterans. They began regulating interstate corporations. You have President Harrison with Senator Henry Lodge proposed a bipartisan federal election board for investigating fraud and disenfranchisement in the Federal Elections Bill of 1890. And disenfranchisements means kind of keeping people from voting. Southerners disliked the idea of government intervening in voting. Northern liberals believed it was too much democracy. And Westerners opposed it and finally defeated the bill. So, alright, the populist. So, 1890, you get Kansas Farmers Alliance joined with the Knights of Labor to form a People's Party. Immediately had success in Kansas state elections. Party grew to national prominence in 1892. It's known as the Populist. They wanted the people to have more power to end poverty and injustices. They desired public ownership of railroad and telegraph systems, protection of land and natural resources, federal income tax on highest incomes, and looser monetary policies to favor borrowers. This is also the group of people who thought wanted to have a silver-backed dollar, and they wanted to put more money into circulation, which, as we know, causes inflation. All right, populist supporters included farmers, and we're talking white farmers, labor groups, prohibitionists, and women's suffrage advocates. The party was ultimately hampered by the large number of private interests who joined. The Populist Party does not last very long. You can see over here, these are some Populist Party victories. Idaho, Nevada, Colorado, Kansas. 20 to 50% of the popular vote in Texas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Washington, and Oregon. And a little bit of showing less than 20% in Montana and California. So a lot of the western states have showings with the Populist Party. 1892 election, you actually have Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and you have James B. Weaver, who is the Populist Party candidate. So he is a third-party candidate. And if you can see the purple, this is going to be Nevada, Idaho, I think that's part of Oregon. Yeah, it's part of Oregon. So maybe they got one electoral vote from Oregon. Colorado, Kansas, and then, again, North Dakota is split 3 ways. They couldn't just decide there. So they actually have a showing in 1892. They get 22 electoral votes. And there's not many elections in history where third-party candidates actually win electoral votes. There's plenty where they win popular votes, but not many where they win electoral votes. So, all right. So the Depression hits in 1893, and it continues until nearly 1900. March of 1893 saw an increase in farm foreclosures and railroad bankruptcies. The stock market crashed in May. And by July, banks were claiming they could no longer grant depositors access to money. Unemployment was above 20%. The middle class grew concerned about possible labor unrest or a new agrarian-based political movement. You have Coxey's Army, which was the picture I showed you at the beginning. Jacob Coxey, who's a radical businessman from Ohio, proposed that the government could hire the unemployed to fix roads. So in 1894, he led a peaceful march to Washington. Coxey was viewed as an extremist by many, but found support among others. Interesting, I think that's always the case. He arrived in Washington and was arrested and jailed. The public blamed upheaval on political radicals and the Democratic Party, or specifically President Cleveland. The debate ensued over free silver and the gold standard. It was supported by Cleveland, but not his party. Cleveland secretly enlisted the help of private bankers to preserve the gold standard, who then turned a tidy profit. People grew even more angry at Cleveland and his party. All right, so the Democratic Party continues to gain strength and power in the South during the 1890s. The People's Party sought to join black and white poor in an effort to help farmers and wage earners. They're not super successful. The Democrats claimed the People's Party was advocating Negro rule, and they were angry to see farmers supporting the cross-racial alliance forced by populists. Democrats used fraud and violence to maintain white supremacy. By 1908, all southern states had literacy tests or poll taxes to keep black men from voting. And it really takes until the Civil Rights Movement to change that. Voter turnout falls dramatically among African Americans and poor whites. Segregation expands. 1899, citizens of Grimes County, Texas established a secret white man's party to keep black men from voting. So, yeah, disenfranchisement, keeping people from voting. And you can see in this map, there are a lot of counties in the South with over 50% population black population. And these are the places that had these poll taxes and these laws and things, because these are the people that were trying to keep black people from voting. All right. So in the 1896 election, Democrats chose William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska, who is a free silver advocate. His vow was, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." And he has a famous cross of gold speech, which is where he says this. He wanted a federal income tax on the wealthy, and he ran as a Democrat without recognizing the importance of populism. Let's see. Marcus Hanna, who is a manufacturer from Ohio who ran the Republican campaign, portrayed Bryan's supporters as revolutionary and anarchist. He sought support from immigrants. William McKinley wins. There are some new limits. Increasingly, voters were excluded from participating in elections. Northern and southern states imposed literacy tests, plus restrictions on immigrants voting. Turnout declines. Direct primaries enabled voters to choose candidates. So the 17th Amendment in 1913 required that U.S. senators be chosen by popular vote. Federal courts used the 14th Amendment to strike down regulatory measures passed in the 1880s. They used the Due Process Clause to shield contract rights. Judges argued that they were protecting workers' freedom from government regulation. Labor and farmers groups disagreed with these decisions. So there's a lot going on where they are basically, the 17th Amendment is a reform. Senators being chosen by popular vote. Before that, they were appointed, basically. So with the 17th Amendment, that's where we actually start voting for our senators and stuff. Alright. Apparently my Norton subscription has expired. Sorry about that. Let's see if we can fix that. Okay. I'll have to get on that. Alright. As far as antitrust legislation goes, Roosevelt, he assumes the presidency after McKinley is assassinated in September of 1901. Generally, and this is Teddy Roosevelt here on the edge of the train talking to people. This is him down here. He's reining in big business. So, generally, he was supportive of business, but during the 1902 coal strike, Roosevelt forced companies to negotiate with the miners' union. Roosevelt's overall opinion of big business was if it was helping out people, he didn't mind it so much. If it wasn't helping out people, that's when he started to have a problem. And so they call him a big trust buster, but he was selective in the trust that he busted. So, let's see. As far as environmental conservation goes, Roosevelt issued 51 executive orders creating wildlife refuges. Refuges. Sorry. I'll learn to speak before I tell you this in class. He oversaw the creation of 3 national parks and used the Antiquities Act to set aside sites such as the Grand Canyon. So thank you, Teddy Roosevelt. Some conservation policies were pro-business. He increased the amount of land held in forest reserves and created the U.S. Forest Service in 1905. However, his forestry chief insisted on fire suppression to maximize logging potential. The Newlands Reclamation Act in 1902 promoted economic development in the West by funding irrigation projects. Roosevelt's legacies. So Roosevelt was full of contradictions. Like I said, with the big business, he picked and chose which trust he would work with. He believed in what he called Anglo-Saxon superiority, yet he incurred criticism after inviting Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House. He advocated elite rule, yet defended the dignity of labor. So, very contradictory man. Holding the sword of public service right here in this picture. This is Teddy Roosevelt. Other men are from U.S. businesses. So you have Jay Gould, you have J.P. Morgan right here, and John D. Rockefeller, which can be up there, I believe. The enormous, seemingly insurmountable challenges from private business industries are well faced by those who fight for the public good. So, Mr. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. All right. The urban settlement movement called attention to poverty in America's cities. Reformers sought to improve labor conditions for women and children. You get the National Child Labor Committee in 1907. hired Lewis Hine to photograph conditions in mines and mills, inspired by a new field of social work. Mueller versus Oregon in 1908 upheld an Oregon law that limited women's work days to 10 hours. Achieved the first law for public assistance for single mothers in Illinois, 1911, and the first minimum wage law in Massachusetts, 1912. Some had concerns that these new laws focused too much on motherhood and not women as equal citizens. Some states experimented with mothers' pensions. Male workers benefited from new workmen's compensation laws. And a proposed constitutional amendment to abolish child labor never won ratification. So you're starting to get this progressive era attitude where you're starting to change things based on problems that have been occurring. So the trust busting because of all the big business guys. The child labor legislation, women's legislation to cut down the work hours and whatnot. So this is why we call this the progressive era. Modern civil rights. So with an increase in discrimination in the South, civil rights leaders become more vocal. So you have W.E.B. Du Bois. He is a Harvard educated, and he advocated higher education for blacks. I believe I told you this the other day, but you have Booker T. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute, advocated education for black men, or black people in general. But he is the advocate that white people liked, because he felt like blacks had to earn their place. Whereas Du Bois, he is the advocate that black people like. Apparently my computer's just going to do all kinds of crazy things today. He advocated higher education for blacks. He just felt people deserved equal rights because they were people. The 1905 formation of the Niagara Principles led to 1909 founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. You also have the National Urban League in 1911, which was a union of agencies that assisted black migrants in the North. These groups grew into powerful force for racial justice. All right. This is Bill Haywood. He said if one man has $1 he didn't work for, some other man worked for $1 he didn't get. Sounds logical. So anyway, the American Federation of Labor was slow to ally with the progressives. But by the 1910s, labor leaders and progressive reformers began to work together. So William Big Bill Haywood, that guy right there, created a new movement. It was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, which you see the logo right there on the right. It supported the Marxist class struggle and believed that a massive general strike could overthrow capitalism. John J. McNamara, a high official in the AFL's Bridge and Structural Iron Workers Union, bombed the Los Angeles Times building as revenge against the anti-union newspaper, killing 20 employees. Labor issues moved high onto the nation's agenda. You know, when bad things happen, like the Triangle Fire. And then people start to kind of go, oh, maybe we should be fixing these things. All right, the election of 1912. So Teddy Roosevelt, he ran, like I said, he got McKinley's election in 1901, so he took over after McKinley was assassinated. He ran for his own term in 1904 and wins that. But in 1908, he decides that he is not going to run. But by and he goes out and he starts hunting and stuff. He goes to Africa and does big game hunting and whatnot. But by 1910, he's returned to politics with a focus on social justice and public welfare. He advocated women's voting rights, minimum wage, and curbs on the power of the courts to halt reform. He sought the Republican nomination in 1912. However, the Republican convention chooses Taft. And why did they choose Taft? Well, Taft was who Roosevelt kind of said, this is who should be the next president. And the Republicans backed him when he decides not to run in 1908. And Taft was he was Roosevelt's friend. Roosevelt thought that he would kind of carry on what he had started. But Taft kind of goes rogue, and so Roosevelt gets unhappy with him. And so he decides that he is going to run on the 1912 ticket anyway, and he's going to create his own political party, and he's going to call it the Progressive Party. Eugene Debs, founded the American Railway Union, served time in prison for radical political action in 1901, and he launched the Socialist Party. I guess I could have finished with Roosevelt. Sorry about that. So this is the 1912 election. Woodrow Wilson runs as the Democratic candidate, William Taft as the Republican. And like I said, Teddy Roosevelt kind of comes in and makes up his own party and calls it the Progressives. Taft almost gets no votes, even though he is the incumbent president. So he was the one who was in office. Oops, that's backwards. He gets almost nothing. Woodrow Wilson comes in and gets 435 electoral votes. And again, Teddy Roosevelt, technically third party at this point, but gets more electoral votes than the Republican candidate does. So how now we get to Woodrow Wilson. So he was the Democratic Party nominee. He was a political scientist and a former president of Princeton University. He advocated reform. He hammered out a program that he called the New Freedom to advocate reform while preserving political and economic liberty. He wins when the Republicans split between Taft and Roosevelt. But if you can look at the split, if they had just chosen one candidate, it would have won the popular vote and likely would have won the presidency. So I don't know if we should blame Taft or Roosevelt for that one, but Wilson turned out to be an amazing president, so maybe nobody's to blame. It's just meant to be. Alright. So Democrats in the era of rising corporate power. Many Democrats believed workers needed stronger government to intervene on their behalf. They struggled with civil rights issues. They passed a federal progressive income tax in 1913 and an inheritance tax. New taxes replaced tariffs as revenue for the country. You have the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Wilson reorganized the financial system to address the absence of a central bank to back up commercial banks in the states. You get the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which creates 12 district reserve banks, funded and controlled by their member banks, with a central Federal Reserve Board to impose regulations. The Federal Reserve had authority to issue currency and set the interest rate. This is still in place today. We still have Federal Reserve. One of the locations actually is in Dallas. Okay. So Wilson and the Democratic Congress aim to prevent trusts from using their power to curb economic competition. So you have the 1914 Clayton Antitrust Act, which is going to actually amend the Sherman Antitrust Act and allow it to kind of be more useful. It leaves the definition of illegal practices flexible, subject to its impact on competition. The new Federal Trade Commission gained broad powers to determine fairness and demand an end to any anti-competitive practices. New Federal Trade Commission investigated companies. The U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations was charged with investigating labor conditions. Conditions blamed the ruthless anti-unionism of American employers for previous cases of violence between workers and employers, and they sought a federal law to protect workers. President Wilson championed a host of bills to benefit American workers. They included the Adamson Act, which established an 8-hour day law for railroad workers, and the Seamen's Act, which eliminated age-old abuses of merchant sailors. So, getting on the move here. Alright, so as far as your progressive legacies go, so you have elitism and racial prejudice embodies in new voting restrictions. Remember the poll taxes and all that. It limited working class power at the polls. It divided power in a federal system and blocked passage of uniform national policies on issues such as child labor. Key social welfare programs did not become a part of the American agenda. And they don't come in until the 30s when they kind of are being forced on us because of the Great Depression. Limitations stem from the power of business interests as well as ethnic and racial division in the working class. As far as their achievements, so more and more prosperous Americans begin to support stronger economic regulations. You have outdated political institutions from the spoils system to the urban machines. They would no longer do, and they require reform. So progressives drew new blueprints for a modern American state, one whose powers were more suited to the needs of an industrial era, which we will continue talking about next time. So I think that is all I have for right now. I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will see you soon.